Thank you so much, Sarah. That was such a lovely introduction. I am so grateful to be doing this session with all you lovely DP psychology educators from across the world. It is an honor. I thought that maybe we could start today's session by checking in on how we feel about the curriculum. So Sarah is just going to put the link of a Mentimeter, okay, a Mentimeter poll in the chat. And I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions about how you feel about this curriculum. Okay, so let's see. Let me present. So let's start with the first one. How would you describe the DP psychology course? So how do you feel about it? Do you think it's challenging? Do you think it's too heavy on content? Do you think that students find it interesting? How do you feel as an educator teaching the course? So just a few thoughts there. If you can type it into the Mentimeter, then that would be really helpful. And then we can see what everyone has to say. Broad, absolutely. I think that's a good way to describe our curriculum. Heavy on content, which is definitely exciting. Absolutely. Any others? How else do you feel about it? I know my students always complain that it used to be very heavy on content. We have, yes, a lot of emphasis on memorization. That's very true. It is an interesting course. I agree with that as well. I think emphasis on memorization goes hand in hand with the curriculum being heavy on content for sure. I'm happy that we will be addressing how to deal with the fact that the curriculum is so heavy on content in our session today. Dynamic, I love that. Very nice. We're getting a varied set of responses. That's so cool. Any more? Let's take a couple more before we go on to the next question. Anyone else? Okay, so since we have a nice word cloud over here of how you guys are seeing the DP psychology curriculum, let's look at our next question, which is, oops, it's not letting me switch the slide. There we go. Yeah. Which assessment component do you find the most challenging to teach? So is it paper 1, paper 2, paper 3? Is it the internal assessment? Which of these do you think are the most challenging for you as a psychology teacher to kind of attempt? Essays. So that goes right across our curriculum. Very nice. Paper 3, paper 3. IA statistics. Okay, great. Paper 2, ERQs. Absolutely. Paper 1. Oh, this is quite a varied response. Very nice. I'm glad that we'll be addressing all of these today in our session. Paper 1, paper 3, extended essay. I completely agree. I think subject specifically psychology, once you get the hang of it, it's good, but getting there is a very difficult journey for an extended essay supervisor in psychology. Analysis, absolutely, I agree. Very good. Shall we pause over here for now and go back to our presentation? This is good. It gives me a good idea of what we actually can look at and what we can focus on in today's session. So I can see that IA is something that's common, and of course writing essays, right? That goes right through the curriculum. We have good tips for paper 3 also. Okay, so today we can look at where you can find resources for stimulus pieces and so on and so forth. So let's get back to this. Okay, so we'll just start with just a general assessment overview, which all of you may be familiar with, but I imagine that we also have a mix of veteran teachers as well as novice teachers, right? So let's just look at what the assessment overview looks like for the standard level and higher level course. So for standard level, we have 2 papers, paper 1 and paper 2, and just the internal assessment. In paper 2, students are expected only to attempt 1 option. Right? When it comes to the higher level, there are 3 papers that students have to attempt along and also the internal assessment. And for paper 2, students are expected to do 2 options. In paper 1, they have something called an HL extension that they're supposed to study as well. And the IA stays the same. Apart from the weightages that might be different from the 2 courses, The IA stays the same for both the curricula. And if you've taught the old curriculum, you know that this is different from how the old curriculum was taught, right? So let's start with the internal assessment. Okay. Before we go on with the internal assessment, I would like to, so like Sarah mentioned, I'm also an internal assessment examiner. There are, when I was not an examiner, I would always wonder as a teacher, why is it that my IAs always get downgraded? Am I doing something wrong? Am I missing out on something as a teacher? Are the students not understanding the concepts well? It used to always puzzle me. But when I became an examiner, I realized that if you're looking at the IA rubric, right, it tells you everything that a student needs to include maybe in their IA. But what they don't tell you is how much do you lose if you miss out on something. So that was quite a bit of an eye opener for me when I became an IA examiner. And keeping that in mind, I thought today we could go over each of the sections of the internal assessment. Okay, at the end of which we can do a little breakout session into a few rooms where we do an exemplar grading. You guys can grade a sample IA, and then we come back to the main session. And I would love to hear what your thoughts are on how the IA was and what you graded the student on. Okay. So let's look at the IA, right? So for those of you who are new to the course, you know that it's where students have to investigate a published study. It's already published. They don't have to create a study on their own. They have to use a study that explains a theory or a model, okay, by conducting an experiment. It's always an experiment. It's not any other research method. It cannot be a survey. It cannot be a case study, an observation, none of the above. It has to always be an experiment. Right. After that, they have to demonstrate their applications of skills and knowledge. So the kind of research that the IB psychology course is heavily focused on, students study about it so much and they get to put that into practice when they are actually conducting this IA, which is a really good experience for students, both when they're in school and also when they go on to university. Right. So a very nice component of the psychology IA is the fact that it involves group work and collaboration for students. So you cannot conduct the IA alone. It has to be in a minimum of 2 or maximum of 4 people in a group. When the IB had initially suggested this as a rule, there were a lot of teachers around the world who had questions saying, but what if I have only 1 student in my class? So they made a provision that allowed teachers to collaborate with teachers from other schools in different parts of their own country or around the world. And the students could gather data with kids from different parts of the world and then conduct their IA together, which was fabulous in terms of collaboration. And it was also such a good way for the students to exhibit their ATL skills, right? We will come to the ATL skills a little bit later. But this is what it was. And it is recommended that you weave your IA into your normal classroom teaching, which is very easy for us as psychology teachers because research is such a heavy focus in our curriculum. And let's start with, and the last is let's look at a sample IA and the checklist. So before we go into the sample IA, let's look at what each of the sections is supposed to entail. Okay, so when I was an IA examiner, and I graded so many IAs together, it became very easy for me to create a checklist that I could share with my students that helped them figure out what needed to be there in every single section of the IA. And the important part is that you can share a checklist with kids, but if they don't know what you mean by certain things, then how are they supposed to go ahead with it? So I thought that maybe in this session, we could go through what each of the points in the checklist means, and then this checklist will be shared with you. So when we are doing our activities together today, we will share a Padlet link in the chat that all of you can access, and it'll have all these resources there for you so that you can use it with your students and in your classes as well. Yeah. So let's look at this. Okay. So the first thing that you need to identify in the introduction is the key concept. So is your IA on memory? Is it on decision making? Is it on emotion? What is it on? So the key concept of the key cognitive process is something that students should ideally identify in the introduction. Okay. As you know, the IA has a very heavy focus on the theory that students have to base the study on. So a good description of the theory is very important. So if you're looking at the decision-making model, the dual process decision-making model, then you should have system 1 and system 2 very well outlined and what they mean. Who was the theory proposed by, so on and so forth. After the theory, a good way for a student to go ahead is to now talk about the study that they will be replicating. So APR, aim, procedure, results. So put the study that they'll be replicating over there. Suppose it's by Tversky and Kahneman. Then what was the aim of the study? What was the procedure? What were the results? A very important part of the introduction is that the students have to establish a link between the results and the theory. And a good way that I teach my students to transfer their skills between the papers and the IA is that this link is somewhat like how they write in SAQs as well, right? So when in an SAQ, you give your concept, you give the study, and then you have to explain the results of the study in terms of the concept. So over here as well, they have to explain the results of the study in terms of the theory. So it's not just enough to say that group one used system one and group two didn't use system one. You have to go ahead and say that because why did group one use system one? Because it was intuitive, because it was a shortcut way of thinking. So you have to be able to link the results of that study that you're replicating to the theory. That is the focus of the internal assessment. Then we come to the aim and relevance of the student's investigation. So what is the aim of their investigation? Okay, and what is the relevance of it? So why is it that decision making is important to study? Why is it that memory is something that has any kind of relevance in real world application? So a good hack over here is to teach them to, maybe when they're talking about the relevance, to put a real world application over there. How is this concept seen in everyday life? And then coming to the technical aspects of the study that they're going to be conducting, what is the IV and the DV, okay? And what are the hypotheses, null, and research? So when I say operationalized, what exactly do I mean? Okay, so if we're talking about a memory experiment, okay, it's not just important to say that, that there was an interval in one and there was no interval in the other. You have to say there was an interval of 5 seconds in one and 0 seconds in the other. And then the participants were told to recall the word list. So operationalizing or saying exactly how you use the IV and the DV in your experiment is very important. You lose quite a chunk of marks if your IV and DV are not operationalized, and so are your hypotheses. Right? So a null, you need to have both a null and a research hypothesis in your introduction as well. So including all of these key aspects in the IA is definitely going to help your student get that highest mark band. Okay, then we have the exploration section. So if you look at the rubric, okay, there is one aspect that separates a student getting in a low mark band to a student getting in a high mark band for the exploration section, and that is whether each of these aspects are described or whether they're explained. So is it just enough to say that they used an independent measures and that they allocated participants into two groups, but why did they use an independent measures? Is it so that they could avoid demand characteristics? Is it so that they could avoid order effects if they're doing an independent measure, so on and so forth? So you have to explain every single aspect. How do you explain the sampling method? Okay, if they use an opportunity sample, what is the benefit? So a good hack that I tell the kids also is that if you want to explain why you're using any of these aspects, look at the benefits of any of them, right? So in opportunity sample, obviously a benefit is the fact that it's very time efficient and it's very easy for the students to gather participants that way. A good way that this has also been implemented in our pandemic batches is also the fact that opportunity sample enables students to gather participants easily because of the pandemic and because they were conducting the experiment online, right? So many different reasons that students can give for explaining the sampling method that they chose. Choice of participants also you need to explain. How do you, so describing it would just say, I had 20 participants, 10 of them were males, 10 of them were females, they were DP2 students, but explain it. So say that you purposely didn't take psychology students just so that they would not guess the aim of the experiment. Say that you chose English speaking participants because you were conducting the experiment in English. So things like this can be explained. What about controls? So again, controls, it's not just important to state it, explaining what are examples of controls. Something like if they had a single blind method, okay, the participants didn't know which group they were a part of, this made sure that there was no demand characteristics. Okay, there was a random allocation of participants to the experimental and the control group to get rid of participant variability. So use psychological terminology when you're talking about the controls as well, because it helps the examiner also to know that, hey, the student knows what they're talking about and their concepts are very strong. Okay, explaining materials is particularly tricky Okay, because there are so many materials. So teachers always have this one question: is an informed consent form a material? I would say no. Okay, if you're looking at the materials of an experiment, it's all the experimental materials that you use while conducting the experiment. So if you're using a word list, then that would be a material. So say, for example, I used a list of 20 words for this experiment. We changed the list of words to make it more culture specific to enable students to take part in the experiment. So why did they change the words around? That would be a good explanation. We conducted our experiment online and therefore we used Zoom because this helped us to easily allocate participants into conditions and also to interact with the participants one-on-one while conducting the experiment. So explaining materials, this is how you can do it. And the procedure, as you know, if you've seen the rubric, it is not part of the rubric, right? But it is a good way for students to show examiners that they have included ethical considerations. Okay, ethics, even though again is not part of the rubric, it's not graded anywhere. If a student shows that they have not used ethics, then the examiner is meant to flag their essay for breaching the IA guidelines. So always make sure that the procedure is a very good place for students to show that they used ethics. So maybe the first point of the procedure can be that participants were invited to be a part of the experiment by sending them an informed consent form. At the end, always say that after the experiment was conducted, participants were debriefed, right? And of course, as you know, the appendix is something that's very important in our psychology IA as well. So always make references to the appendices and make sure you tell the students to put screenshots of each of these aspects in their appendices. We'll have a checklist for the appendices as well. Okay, then like we saw in our word cloud, IA analysis is something that can be very tricky for teachers to handle. But to the credit of the IB, they have made it fairly simple for us. Okay, so when you're looking at the IA, you know that depending on whether it is an independent measures design or a repeated measures design, you can teach this to students, right? Which statistic goes well with which research design. So obviously it's recommended that you as a teacher don't tell them which one to do, but you teach it to them when you're explaining this section to them. Teach them the different kinds of statistics, teach them which one goes hand in hand with each design, and then let that group figure out which statistic needs to be chosen. So if we're looking at a checklist for the analysis, you start with your descriptive stats table. Okay, your descriptive stats can be either your mean, median, mode. Okay, you have your measures of dispersion, which can be a range or it can be a standard deviation. So you should have a little summary table that shows what both the groups got in the experiment. By the way, I'm also saying both the groups because the psychology IA is meant to be a simple experiment. Okay, it is advised that you only stick to two groups. This is just to get students familiar with the idea of how to conduct an experiment, right? So two groups is more than enough. Don't do more than that because then even the statistics gets very complicated. So I like to tell them to stick to two groups and then teach them the stats and then they have to apply them, right? You also have, so once you have a table over there, you interpret the descriptive stats. What does it mean that the mean of this group was higher than the mean of that group? Okay, you can interpret it in terms of your model if you want over here. Then you have your graph. The graph actually also has its own checklist, which will be there in the checklist that's there on the Padlet. But you know, very basic mistakes like your graph is supposed to be a bar graph. Both the bars should not be touching because they're unrelated sets of data, right? You have to label the X and the Y axes, and you have to make sure that the Y axis always represents your values really well. So suppose you have a word list of 20 words and the highest was, what do you say, like 15, and you stop your graph over there. Your graph should still go up to 20 to show that this was the maximum that they could have recalled, but 15 is where the maximum that the participants were able to recall. So this is very important for students to do. Coming to the inferential stats, okay, we don't need a table or a graph for this, but choosing the inferential stats is very important. Okay, one good thing about the IA is now that students don't need to explain which stat that they chose, but I still have them put just that one line. Since the experiment used an independent measures design, we chose and had unrelated sets of data, we chose a Mann-Whitney U test. And you know that if it's a repeated measures design, then usually it's the Coxon sign ranks test, right? So you can say which one you chose, okay, and give that one line of explanation of why you chose it. Then you have the interpretation. So what does it mean? So when you have the data, and as psychology teachers, I know it's nice to make them do the stats by hand, but don't do it. Okay, always rely on an online calculator, because you have to show evidence for your inferential stats calculation in the appendix. If you don't, they lose half the marks in the section. So you have to have a screenshot of that online calculator. So whether you're using VASA stats or whether you're using social science statistics, okay, both of these are very good resources. VASA stats and social science statistics are online calculators that are easy to use. Once they inputted their data and they get the results, you always get to see, right, if the result was significant or not. And for psychology studies, a measure of significance is whether the p-value is lesser than or equal to 0.05. So if it was, then it means that the results are significant and the difference between the two groups is because the IV had an effect on the DV. So this is how you interpret your inferential stats. Sorry, let me just go back there. And it's also very important at the end of your analysis section to link your statistics, your results to the hypothesis. So once you say the results are significant, you will say, therefore, we reject the null hypothesis and we accept the research hypothesis that says that, and then you can restate your hypothesis over there. But it's very important for you as a teacher to tell your students that they have to link it back to the hypothesis as well. Okay. And the last section of the internal assessment, which is your evaluation. Okay. Evaluation also, more often than not, one of the biggest mistakes that students make is that they compare the results of their study to the results of the original study. That is not there in the rubric. They do not need to do that at all. They need to be looking at the results and explaining the results in terms of the model. Always refer to the model. If they want to make a reference to the original study, that's fine. They can do it, but they can't do it at the expense of knocking out the explanation with the model, right? So they have to always refer to the model when they are linking their results. Always explain it in terms of the model. After that, if you look at the rubric, the second most common mistake that students make in the evaluation section is the fact that they will, only talk about either design, sample, or procedure. But if you look at the mid-range mark band and the high-range mark band, there is an and over there. Okay, so if you want the highest, it has to be the strengths and limitations of the design, sample, and procedure. Okay, it's not all. So all three of them, you should have a strength and limitation. And in the mark band, you'll also see that it says the modification has to be explicitly linked to the limitation. So it's not just enough for students to think of different ways to conduct their experiment. But if they're saying that, hey, a limitation of my repeated measures design was the fact that there was a practice or a fatigue effect, a modification should be linked to that practice or a fatigue effect. Okay, if they're saying that a limitation of their sample was that it was not representative enough because they used an opportunity sampling method, then a modification can be to use a random sampling method. Okay, these are just examples. Of course, there are so many different limitations that could be there. The same way in their procedure, if there was anything wrong with the way they conducted the experiment, they should give a modification for how to address that error. Right? And then a good way to end the evaluation and the IA then is to just have a statement of conclusion at the end saying, hence, the results of our experiment are significant and show that, and you can repeat the hypothesis over there. Or you can say we accept our research hypothesis or we reject our null hypothesis in those terms. That's a good way to go about it. Here comes the appendices, a non-graded part of your IA, but it is responsible for so much that is there in all of the other 4 sections. Okay, an IA proposal has weightage in a sense because it helps to show the examiner that there was no academic, there's no authenticity issue. So if you show an IA proposal, it shows that, okay, the student has been working on the IA for a really long time. Of course, a screenshot of the IA proposal should include, say, a teacher signature or a timestamp or something like that to show when they started working on the IA. A letter of consent and all of these, right? Letter of consent, debriefing note, all of these show that you followed ethics. Standardized instructions show how you conducted your experiment. Experimental materials, okay? These are basically word lists that you used. Maybe you can put in links of songs or something that the participants may have used in their experiment. Raw data is very important. Okay, so the students have to put a screenshot of their raw data. You don't need to have a screenshot of your descriptive stats, but a screenshot of the raw data and a screenshot of the inferential stats is very, very important. If they do not include this, they will get half or less than half the marks in criterion 3, which is the analysis section. Okay, so as a teacher, you must warn them and make sure that they include these things in the appendices of their IA. And of course, these are just basic checks for the checklist, is just in terms of presentation. As you know, if you look at the guide, now as part of the IA, you have to mention these things on your cover page. A student has to give their candidate code and has to give the group members candidate code, because now the IA is conducted in groups. Okay, so the school is always notified if these details are missing, because the examiner will flag it, of course. And then, of course, page numbers, in-text citations, works cited, all of these should be there. Right. So now will be a good time for us to put these checklists into practice. So Sarah is going to put a link for the Padlet in the chat. In the Padlet, you will find two things that you can use for this breakout session. One is called the sample I, which is what you will be grading with the rest of the teachers in your breakout room. It would be really nice if all of you could speak and collaborate with each other while you're doing this, so that you guys can share your own thoughts and experiences of how you go about this in your classrooms. And the second resource that you'll be using while grading is the IA checklist. The IA sample checklist is also there in the Padlet. So use that when you are in the breakout room with others as well. Okay. Hopefully this is not going to take more than 10 or 15 minutes. I don't need you to go through every single word, but just use the checklist to see whether you can find these specific elements that are there in the IA. Great. Looks like everyone is back. Okay. How was it? What did you guys think? So if we can have one representative from each group just talking about what your group thought about the IA, then maybe we can have everyone just hear your thoughts on it. So can we start with breakout room 1?
Yes, we can start. We just read introduction and exploration. And have discussed.
So you didn't get through.
Yes, because we have some discussions and we just stopped on controls variables.
Okay. Understood. So you were on control variables.
Yes.
Okay, so through the introduction and the exploration, how did you find the quality of the IA so far? Was it good? Did you think it was mediocre? Maybe it didn't meet the mark?
Yes, we think that it was good, about five marks. One lady in our group just said that 4, 5, between 4 and 5.
Okay.
And yes, and we think that it could be more developed, the anchoring effect and a link between theory and study for application.
Okay, so you think those were there?
No, we think that these parts, these parts could be more developed.
Okay, understood.
In introduction. Melissa, Vaidyan, how about you?
In the introductions, we think that the model is described, but the link to the investigation is not really explained.
Okay.
I think that's what we are talking about. And then in the explorations, we are talking about some about the control variables. And yeah, I think that's where we stop.
Okay, sure, no problem. Yeah. What about breakout room 2? I think that was Alexander and Christine and Valentin. What did you guys think?
Okay, in fact, we covered everything with Valentin, and he will correct me if I'm wrong, but we've got an opinion that the student covered everything, all the requirements, the comparative, with your checklist. Valentin got a very good idea that, in fact, it could be unidirectional, not bidirectional, because we have a theory over there, and theory makes a clear prediction. Still, considering that it was just 11 students which participated in the experiment, anyway, it will be insignificant, no doubt about that. Also, we have a question, is it okay to use any standard statistical packages like Spss or Starter or whatever? Because, we have access to that, and I don't really don't like students, doing it on website instead of Udemy.
You can. The only thing is, whichever statistical tool you use, you should be able to show evidence for it in the appendices. The moment you don't show evidence that they conducted the inferential stats, then they begin losing their grade. So whichever, even if it's SPSS, whichever one it is, as long as they're showing a screenshot to show that, yes, they did the calculation, that is good.
Good. Good.
Yeah, and the calculation, the screenshot of the, sorry, this one more thing I forgot to mention. In the screenshot of the calculation, it's very important to show what the significance level is. So that should always be a part of the screenshot as well.
For SPSS, it's always there. So
yes,
there is no way to
SPSS, it's always there. Yeah.
Thank
Great.
you.
No problem. That's nice. Very nice. What about breakout room 3?
Well, we thought that the same, as the first group, the introduction, we've gone through the introduction as well as the exploration analysis.
Okay.
So we felt that in introduction, the link was missing.
Okay.
That is an important thing that was missing. I also felt that somehow the dependent variable was not operationalized properly. In exploration, we could not find any error. We thought that if we all agreed, that it is perfect, all the points were covered. In analysis section, we just identified one. I won't say that it is an error and the child should be penalized for that, but in descriptive statistics, only the child is talking about, whether or not the hypothesis is
correct.
So that is something that we identified. And in the evaluation section, again, the theory was not very well linked. The link was not explained again, yes, with the results. And there were certain superficial points that we observed where the child is talking about the generalization and, the number of participants being less and all those things. So there were certain superficial points. In the end, when the child was closing the candidate, it was not mentioned, the results needs to be again stated again at what level of significance the results were, stated. So that is missing. So overall, we felt that it was a mediocre IA, not a very brilliant one. I mean, in some, yeah, so this is what we felt.
Okay, not bad. Thank you for your inputs. You actually do make a very good point with the evaluation section about giving very superficial points. When you're talking about generalizability and maybe a small sample size, it's not a very good evaluation to use for the IA, especially because the aim for us is not to generalize. And the IB says that it has to be a simple experiment. So the sample size will always be small. So these two evaluations can be avoided. You're not going to get downgraded for it, but it doesn't show a very good quality of critical thinking on the part of the student, right? And we have the last breakout room. What did you guys think of the IA?
Hello.
Hi, Gaksal.
So I received the link later. We couldn't discuss much. I think I just discussed with Alexandra a little bit. We were rushing through actually. But for my point of view, the introduction was not too bad. Just the intake citation in the first paragraph when the student says just pop of cherry. I always tell my students to include the year as well. I think that's the proper way of doing it, right? Not just writing the.
It depends on the citation style that you're using. So if you're using an APA, then you have to put the year in. So I think the student has used an MLA citation style. So in the MLA, just the name of the author is fine. You don't need to put in a year over there. Yeah.
Okay. So I recommend all of my students to use APA actually. Looking at the description of the theory, it's not too bad. I would just suggest the student to include why anchoring bias happens or why people go on with the system one thinking, linking it to the fact that we are generally cognitive misers and we choose the easiest path, the shortest way of doing things. So this could have been included because the description of the theory is there, but the depth could have been elaborated further. Other than that, the description of the study is there, it's good. And then looking at the relevance to the investigation, there is a point in there, I thought about it. So I thought that it wasn't missing because the students said the anchoring bias is very useful in a wide variety of fields and explained it. So I like that explanation. IV is there, DV is not operationalized, I agree.
Yes.
Null hypothesis is there and research hypothesis. They can put a non-alternative hypothesis, right? I generally suggest my students to use one-tailed, but I think this is also acceptable as far as I know.
It is acceptable, but yes, one tail is definitely a lot easier for students to understand and help them to frame the, the hypotheses for sure.
Yeah, so I would give an introduction a 5. Exploration, research design is okay. Sampling technique, I thought is a bit problematic because student is talking about how they were readily available, grade 11 students. However, how actually they obtained the participants, this is a bit vague. This could have been elaborated further. For example, for my students that they did it online, they always say first they email to their teacher to ask for their permission, and then they receive the link, and then they join to the Zoom classroom and then ask participants based on their availability whether they would like to join or not. So maybe this could have been included as well. That's what I thought. Other than that, choice of participants, just the little details I'm obsessed with. The nationality is missing. For example, the median age, for example, or mean age is missing. The rest is okay. Other than that, I think the exploration is good. So I would give this a 3. Analysis, well, with the analysis, the graph, when I look at the graph, the general independent variable title is missing in the x-axis. So as I always tell my students, put the IV and also the general IV and also the DV, which is on the y-axis, is not operationalized enough, I think. Other than that, the inferential statistics is there. The interpretation of the bar graph. I always tell my students to interpret the bar graph as well. I think that is missing.
Okay.
Evaluation is the weakest part of this IA, I think, and also for most of my students as well. It's very difficult to achieve the 6. I don't remember giving anyone a 6, to be honest with you. It's been a long time. So for example, the first paragraph, am I talking too much, by the way? I can show.
No, that's okay. I think it's helping all the other teachers to hear how you're grading the IA as well. That's very nice. Yeah.
So with the evaluation first paragraph, I would tell my students to write the results of the original experiment and the replicated study results and then compare them. And then to see whether there are differences between the results. And also, if there are differences, what are the possible explanations for those differences?
So Goksal, over there, I'll stop you because that the students don't need to do at all. They don't need to talk about the original and compare the results. They just need to be talking about the results of their study and how they explain the model. Because if they're doing that, they're just going to be losing words, and they only have 2,200 words in this IA. So that doesn't need to be done anymore. It used to be there in the old IA, now not anymore for this new one.
I see. That's good to know. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Other than that, looking at the independent measures design, I think the strength of the experiment is generically written, right? Because it doesn't really explain anything. And also modification, it needs to be explained further as well. The evaluation is not too bad. It's just, I would give this a 3 or 4. In general, I think it's a good IA. It's not too bad. It would probably get a 6 or, out of 6 or 7, I think. Yeah, that's all that I can say, actually. That's it.
I agree pretty much with Goksal. I think it's probably going to get a 6. It probably loses 1 mark on each criteria. I do have one question though about the operationalization of the dependent variable, because how would you operationalize it? I mean, they've said it's the median of the estimate given. I mean, you want to say that it's a number? Like, I mean, how could we operationalize that more?
So I don't think you can operationalize this more. I mean, the only thing that you can do is probably, the estimation of the product of the numbers provided by the participant. But I think this, the way the dependent variable is given over here is fine. So just to, I realize that in my Padlet, I haven't given the annotated sample of this IA, so I will make sure that I do put that up. But the student did get a 7, so I think they got an 18 on 22 in this IA, which did get them 7 grades. So you guys are quite spot on actually. It did very well. So the student was more or less met all the criteria on this checklist. Yeah. I'm going to quickly move on to the external assessment. Valentin, are you saying something? Because I can't hear you still. I don't know if you're on mute or if your microphone is not working. Or maybe you can put your question in the chat.
Hi, may I ask a question?
Of course.
What if the null hypothesis should be retained? I mean, like, what if there is no connection, connections between the two groups? I mean, like, what important part the student needs to explain when the result is not significant?
Yeah. So when the result is, that's a very good question actually, because a lot of the times we do find not significant results, right? Especially because the sample sizes in psychology experiments tend to be so small. So when it comes to the evaluation section and they want you to explain the results in terms of the model, it's important for the student to still talk about the model, say that as per the model, this is what should have ideally taken place. So this is what the results should have been, but in our experiment, this is not what we found. And they can give a reason or two as to why this did not happen for their group. So they can say that the sample size was too small or that the participants didn't understand the instructions too well, but they should still make a reference to the model and then give a reason as to why these results were not found in their sample. That's a good way to go about it.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. Can you hear me now, Susan?
Yes. Perfect. Well,
okay, great. Fix the issue. So just 2 quick questions. Okay. One.
Yeah.
In the analysis section, so the student use the median and then standard deviation, but standard deviation should be used together with the mean. Standard deviation only makes sense when the distribution is normal. The student lose marks there, so
the student will lose marks there in the analysis. You're right. So that's a good hack. So whenever you're using the mean, you can use a standard deviation, because standard deviation tells you what the spread of scores is from the mean. If you're using a median, then you need to use an interquartile range or an IQR. So that is a good measure of dispersion to use when you have a median as your measure of central tendency. And if you have a mode, technically you don't need anything.
Yeah, I mean, there is variation ratio can be calculated for the mode as a measure of dispersion. Okay.
Yeah, but the IB doesn't expect it from DP2 students because it is a little bit more advanced in terms of statistics. So it's okay.
Really? I find the variation ratio to be more straightforward than the, for example, standard deviation. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. One more question. So in the exploration section, so student explains the choice of their materials and everything. In the evaluation section, there is some overlap. In the evaluation section, they evaluate their choice again.
Yes.
So there's some overlap. So how in depth should they write their explanations, or can they refer to the fact that they already explained them in the exploration section?
So I would say don't refer to the fact that they already said it. There is bound to be a little bit of overlap between the exploration and the evaluation, and that's okay. It's not a bad thing.
If students can refer to the fact that they already, so other than explain the same thing again in 5 sentences, mention in 1 sentence, this was explained in the exploration section already.
So no, I would say explain it again. Don't do that, because then the examiner will, think that they're just trying to save on words or something. So maybe, like I said, so in the explanation, if you're using the fact that a benefit is a way for you to explain why you used a design or something, maybe you can think of another benefit when you're doing the evaluation section. So as much as possible, don't try to, but even if you are overlapping a little bit, and there will be a little bit of overlap, it's okay. Because the evaluation section is mainly there for you to critique everything that's there in the exploration. So it's fine. It's perfectly all right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So can we move on to the next section, which is basically our external assessment. Okay, so we're not going to be doing an exemplar marking for the external assessment, but I thought it was just because the external assessment, and like we mentioned, we saw in the Mentimeter, it's very content heavy and it's very difficult for a teacher to actually manage that kind of content. So I thought a good way to go about it was to actually look at ways for teachers to help students in choosing what to revise and what to teach even in class to help you with time management. Okay, I don't need to go over all the different approaches that there are in paper one, but as you know, just as an overarching concept, in paper one, you have the biological approach, the cognitive approach, and the sociocultural approach. Okay, so all students, paper one is compulsory, but as you know, HR students have something called an HR extension in each of these approaches. Okay, this is also an HL extension. I haven't mentioned that here, but globalization is an HL extension for the socio-cultural approach as well, right? And if you look at the way the guide is structured now, you know that there is a topic column and a content column, and this is how the IB frames the questions for students. Okay, so even for my own exams in school, when I was teaching, when I would always frame the questions in an IB format, even for their tests and for their exams, as much as possible, stick to it. And they've done it very nicely in the sense, they've given you comments over there, right? Everything that is in bold can come as an AO2 or AO3 question, and anything that is in italics will only come as an AO2 question. What do I mean by AO2 and AO3? Those are assessment objectives. So AO1 and 2 will apply to SAQ questions, and AO3 and 4 can apply to ERQ questions. Okay, so if you look at your guide, it will tell you these things very clearly. So now, how do you deal with large amounts of contents in paper one? Okay, one way to do it is to teach all three approaches and at least 2 studies per topic, right? Because a question can come either as a short answer question or an SAQ, or an extended response question or an ERQ. So you need to be doing at least 2 studies per topic that is there in the, per content actually, that is there in the guide. Okay, one way for you to cut down on this, because this tends to be very heavy. So as a teacher, you can teach all 3, and I would suggest that yes, you in paper 1 teach all 3 approaches. But what can you tell your students when they are revising? Okay, for one, when it comes to the exam, tell the students that they do not need to study all 3 approaches in complete detail. Let them pick one approach and study that at an ERQ level. Okay, so suppose the biological approach is what they're most comfortable with. Okay, let them pick that approach and do 2 studies or 3 studies per topic for that one approach. And for the cognitive and social cultural, they can just do one study each, because as you know, in paper 1, for section A, it's compulsory, right? But for section B, you have options. And you know how they're going to ask the question. In the options, the students have to attempt 1 ERQ from each approach. So if they do 1 approach at an ERQ level, they're sorted. The other 2 they can do at an SAQ level. It is a risky revision strategy, but if you feel that your students can handle it, and if it will help them manage the amount of content that they have to study for an examination, then by all means go for it. Okay. Another thing that teachers, and this has gained popularity with a lot of DP teachers, I find, is to only teach 1 HL extension. Okay, because again, with the HL extensions, in the guide says there will be at least 1 ERQ that comes from an HL extension. It can be from biological, cognitive, or sociocultural, or it could be all 3 of them, right? But if you're teaching that 1 HL extension, it helps the students with whichever approach they are studying at an ERQ level. This is for HR students. So for HR students, whichever approach they're studying at an ERQ level, they should be doing the HL extension for that approach as well. That's the only thing. I haven't mentioned this here, but riskiest of all strategies that were also discussed by a few teachers is to only teach the extensions. So tell the HR students to only do the extensions for the exam and do all the other approaches at an SAQ level. I don't advise that. I think that's way too risky and it could confuse the students quite a bit. But these few strategies can actually help you kind of cut down and help the students cut down on how much they have to memorize for paper 1, because it's that much content, right? When we're at the end of this, we'll have a best practices sharing. So over there, we can also talk about how to help students, what do you say? Divide the content very well or organize their content well as also. But let's just quickly go to SAQs. SAQs are actually very easy to score in for a student. Okay, I always tell my kids that they should always include a few things compulsorily in their SAQs. One is obviously talking about the concept and giving it context in the introduction. The second part of the SAQ has to be about the study, where they talk about the aim, procedure, and the results. And this part, okay, this is where most students lose out. In your rubric, it says the response is supported by appropriate research, which is described and explicitly linked to the question. So the research is very well described, but explicitly linked to the question is what students forget to do. So they'll always just describe the study, but when it comes to linking it, they don't. So they won't say, suppose we're talking about the social identity theory, for example. Okay, you give the description of the theory in the introduction, you give the study, but when you're linking the results to the study, you should be, the student should be able to look at the results of the study and say, this result shows us that social categorization took place. This result shows us that there was in-group favoritism. This result shows us that participants gained self-esteem from the group that they were a part of, right? So linking the results of the study back to the concept or the theory that's in the introduction is a very important part of your SAQ. And if you look at the rubric, this is the difference between a 7 to 9 and a 4 to 6. If you look at the 4 to 6 mark band, that explicitly linked is not there. But if you're looking at the 7 to 9 mark band, this is there. So helping your students include this one little aspect will help to push them to that extra higher grade, right? Okay. ERQs. This one can be very tricky for teachers, okay? And this is a very, very helpful resource that I have put in our Padlet as well, okay? So this is by Alexei Popov. If you use the Oxford textbook, then he is the author of that textbook, okay? And I've had the pleasure of working with him on a few workshops, and this is a resource that he had created for one of our Asian IB Association workshops. Okay, and he said that there are two ways for you to write an ERQ. One is a study-based approach, which is what a lot of us do. And I am a teacher who's taught in India always. And I know that Indian students need a lot of structure. So a study-based approach worked very well for me. But if you have students who like to be a little bit more argumentative in their approach in writing and don't need that kind of structure, then the argument-based approach is great. Okay, so if you look at, I have put 2 videos in the Padlet as well, where Alexei is talking about each of these approaches and shows you what the difference between them is and how you can teach this to students. I've shown this video to my students on several occasions, and it really helps them narrow down these 2 ways of essay writing. So what I do is in year 1, in DP1, I teach them the study-based approach because it helps them organize really well with paper 1. Once they have pinned this down, once they have nailed this down on how to write a study-based approach, when we go to year 2 and I start paper 2, I start giving them a little bit more freedom in writing their essays, and that's when they learn how to hone this argument-based writing style for paper 2. Yeah, so these are just a few approaches that you can use when you're teaching students how to write an ERQ. I will also be sharing this presentation in the Padlet, guys, so that you can have access to it as well, and you can use it with your students also. Okay, should we take some, actually, you know what, we can do the Q&A right at the end since we're running short of time. So let's pause on that and let's just quickly go to paper 2. Again, I'm not going to go into what each of these options means, but you know that there are 4 options in paper 2. Okay, abnormal psychology, developmental health, and psychology of human relationships. If you open your guide, you will see that there are different units or chapters under each of these, okay? And there are 3 in each of these options. So while it does seem daunting to teach 1 option for SL and 2 for HL, what the IB has done is made it a little easier for you. So what is the risky revision strategy over here? Okay. Pick and choose chapters within an option, and for the exams, students can just study 1 chapter from each approach. So for example, the IB says that you have to teach 2 approaches or 2 options for HR students. So suppose I'm doing abnormal psychology and developmental psychology as the 2 options. Okay, do students have to study all these 6 chapters? No, they don't. Because if you look at the question paper, in the options, in paper 2, for each options, 3 questions are asked and students have to attempt only 1 from each option if you're an HR student, right? That's 2 ERQs for them to write. And the way the questions are framed is that each question will come from each chapter. So a student can just do one chapter very thoroughly in one option, another chapter very thoroughly in another option, and then they should be okay to go. They don't need to burden themselves with doing all 6 of these and then having a scattered brain. So you can teach it to them as a teacher in class, but when it comes to their revision and when they have to study, tell them to just do one chapter from an approach. And if they're a little unsure, if you think they're weak, then tell them to do 2. But they don't need to do all 3. It saves them a lot of time and a lot of brain space as well when it comes to an examination. Just as a side note, these are all the options. These requirements are there in a regular IB exam, but as all of you may know, in our last exam session and even for this one, there is no paper 2 for SL, and HR students have to only attempt one option, and there's no paper 3. But this is only for the May 22 session. Going forward, they will keep making updates and changes, but this is only for the pandemic batches because students have not been able to go to school. Teachers have not had access to their students very easily. So this is why the IB made these, revisions, but this is only for the pandemic batches, not going forward. So if for May 22, SL doesn't have any paper 2 and HL only has one option. Okay. Again, we'll take the questions at the end. And of course, paper 3. Okay, paper 3, now you know they have separated it into quantitative versus a qualitative approach. Oops, I just realized that my 2 titles are mixed, but this is your qualitative should be here, quantitative should be there. But as you know, the nicest thing about paper 3 also is the fact that there are static questions. So if you don't know what that means, if you open up the psychology guide and if you go to the assessment part of paper 3, all the questions are already given over there. Okay, your question 1 is going to come exactly like how it's given in the guide. Question 2, there are 2 options given in the guide. One of them will come in your paper. And for question 3, there are 3 options in the guide and one of them will come in your paper. So you don't ever need to worry what question can possibly come. You already know the questions. So now your onus as a teacher is just to teach the students how they can apply the knowledge that they have about each of these research methods to fit those questions. The tricky part about paper 3 obviously is the fact that there is an unseen passage. So as a teacher, what do you do? Okay, my go-to places for finding stimulus pieces for paper 3 was In Thinking, which I thought was a fabulous resource for me as a novice teacher. And they have so many lovely stimulus pieces over there, along with answers to help you as a teacher when you're guiding your students. Facebook communities. I don't know if you guys are on the IB Psychology Facebook group, but it is such a huge group with so many DP collaborators from all over the world. And people are constantly sharing resources on there, including paper 3 stimulus pieces. So make sure that you do join the group. And if you want, maybe I can put the link of this group in our Padlet as well, so that you can access, you can go use the link over there to join the group. And of course, my IB has also a bunch and ton of resources for you to access. In case you don't know what my IB is, please get in touch with your DP coordinator, tell them that you want a username and a password to join this portal as a DP educator. And there is a resource center over there for all DP educators, subject specific. Okay, so you can go there, find annotated assessments, sample papers, the works, everything that you need, you will be able to find over there. Okay, and yeah, just a quick way, how can you integrate your internal and external assessments? So like we already spoke about, our DP psychology course is very heavily based on research and ethics, right? These are the 2 broad lenses by which we view the entire course. So a good way for you to integrate this is by helping students conduct mock IAs. I love to make them do this. They love being little experimenters and researchers on their own. So you just give them a little bit of guidance and then they can go ham and conduct whatever experiments they want to. Of course, when it comes to conducting a real experiment in DP2 or conducting an IA in DP2, you have to give them those guidelines. But in DP1, let them have fun with it. Let them learn what it's like to conduct experiments. Let them learn what it's like to work in groups. It's a great way to introduce statistics to them. Okay, so that it doesn't seem so daunting to them when they start conducting the real IA, like, hey, what am I supposed to do over here? And of course, a great way to make them take it seriously is to make it a summative. So let it be a part of your testing component in DP1 so that they can get used to it. Of course, formative assessments are also a great way for you to integrate your internal and external assessments. And a great way for you to conduct a thumb rule for your formative assessments is always to use your ETL skills, okay? Thinking, research, social communication, self-management. So in DP1, I make them do a lot of ETL work with a lot of scaffolding. I give them guidelines. I let them know that, hey, this is how you can improve on your thinking skills, on your research, on communication, self-management, all the different ones. But when it comes to DP2, because they've learned all this in DP1, I give them a lot more freedom. So this is just one way I find, like, Socratic seminars are so good to help your students practice critical thinking, communication, research. A lot of these skills get targeted with this activity. But going forward, I mean, like when we're doing our best practice sharing, you can also think of other ways to do it. And of course, summative assessments, I try to stick very strictly to IB prescribed formats of assessment. So having them do a lot of essay writing practice, practicing paper 3, SAQs, ERQs, like I said in DT1, give them a lot of scaffolding, give them a lot of guidance and support, let them learn how to do it, and then give them a little bit freedom to assert themselves and see how best they want to engage with the content. Okay, so that's pretty much what I have for you guys today. I've got a little tab on our Padlet where we can share our best practices, okay, whether it was with any of the papers or with the IAs, what has worked best for you as a teacher. And Sarah, do we have time or are we just about finishing?
Actually, time is up, so we need to wrap quickly through this.
Okay, fine. So time is up. So I thought maybe we could have a discussion over here on best practice sharing, but since we don't have the time, I would really appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody in this group would also really appreciate if you could put down your thoughts and your ideas and practices that you use in your DP classrooms in the Padlet so other teachers can have access to it. I find that having taught psychology for 7 years, the thing that helped me the most was having, experienced teachers and ideas from so many teachers from all over the world. It was just the best. So this is the only way for us to build this community and to make sure that the students get the best of everything, So yeah, that's it from me.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much for today. It was a very informative session. I'm sure everyone who joined in is taking away very useful insights. If you're interested in knowing more about how you can use Toddle at your school, we're doing a quick walkthrough to show you the DP planning module today at 10:45. That's in 15 minutes. Do drop into that session using the link in the chat. So I will be dropping that link in the chat for you. Alternatively, you can demo using also the second link in the chat at your own convenience. Thank you for joining us today. Stay safe and see you in our next event.